The final day of our conference looking at cultural diplomacy in the European Union. I'm very happy this morning to have the chance to have two European voices to begin with our keynote addresses. First from Georgia and then from Germany, even though he's actually based in Brussels now. I'd like to say a few words, first of all, about our opening speaker, Her Excellency Ambassador Salome Samadashvili. And also just to say regarding the plan for today, as far as I know, it should go exactly as indicated in the program. So far I do not know of any changes, so we should be able to follow the program as it is printed. And I look forward to also encouraging a lot of your interaction today. This is our last chance to ask questions, to make comments, really to engage each other also in questions and exchanges. Not necessarily that we will all agree on these issues, but at least that we'll have the chance to discuss them. So ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker of the morning, is Her Excellency Ambassador Salome Samadashvili, the Ambassador of Georgia to the European Union. Her Excellency holds a degree in comparative constitutional law from the Central European University in Budapest, as well as a master's degree in public policy from American University in Washington, D.C. From 1997 until 1998, Her Excellency served as the Chancellor at the Georgian Embassy in the United States. And in 2000, she worked as a development consultant for the Karama Corporation in Washington, D.C. From 2002 until 2004, Her Excellency worked as a parliamentary program officer for the American National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. And in 2004, she became the deputy chair of the Committee on Foreign Relations of the Georgian Parliament. Her Excellency Ambassador Samadashvili now serves as the Ambassador of Georgia to the European Union, and the lecture topic that she heard is reminding me a little bit of the famous rock song that I'm familiar with, Knocking on Europe's Door, Future of the EU-Georgia Relations. Please join me in a very warm welcome for Her Excellency Ambassador Salome Samadashvili. Thank you.
I hope that you have enjoyed your discussions in the European Parliament over the course of last several days. I think that this is fascinating and challenging time for Europe and maybe for the world, and I'm sure you have learned a great deal. I know that the topic of the conference is the cultural diplomacy and maybe the future of EU-Georgia relations. It's something that does not necessarily fit into the into the title of cultural diplomacy, but I will tell you why I have decided to talk about it. Well, A, because I'm Ambassador of Georgia. That's my job, to promote my country and talk about the future of Georgia and the EU. That's what I'm paid for. And B, because I think it's very much also about culture, what we are doing here and what we're trying to do in terms of bringing Georgia closer to Europe. Why is it about culture? Because, if you look at the map and if you look at Georgia, especially those who are not maybe very familiar with the European geography, you might think, well, Georgia and in Europe, maybe that's a bit far-fetched idea, and though Napoleon said geography is the fate or a destiny, you might think that Georgians are trying to defy their destiny by trying to find their place in Europe. And I think that actually, the strongest argument for why Georgia belongs in Europe has always been a cultural argument. And actually, I'm a third ambassador of Georgia accredited to the European Union since we regained our independence in 1991. But the story of Georgia's attempt to integrate itself with Europe goes really, really much farther, into the history with and my real predecessor, first predecessor, was the Georgian monk, philosopher, and writer, Sultan Sabah-Orbeiliani, who in the beginning of the 18th century traveled to the European courts and to the Pope in Rome, trying to, at the time it was Louis XIV in Paris and Pope Clement XI in Rome, and he tried to convince them that Georgia as a Christian nation really belongs with Europe. And Georgia has positioned itself as the part of Europe ever since the emergence of Islam in the 7th century created antagonistic relationship between Islam and Christianity. And Georgia, being one of the oldest Christian nations, of course, saw itself very firmly in the camp, if you wish, of the Christian nations. In fact, Georgian kings have proposed a number of times to the European monarchs at the time to participate in the wars, in the crusades, and there were discussions about the possibility of this, but then circumstances changed, and we actually never let's say succeeded in actually positioning ourselves with Europe, even though we were at some point even considering to convert into Catholicism to be embraced by Europe at that time. Well, I don't want to talk too much about the history, but I simply, considering that people probably here and beyond don't know much about Georgia, I want to say that, who knows how the European future of Georgia would have developed if the Bolshevik Revolution didn't happen in 1917, because of course then Georgia was part of the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire at the time was, let's say, there were different options for the future, but Bolsheviks have managed to overthrow the Tsarist regime, and in the end, in Russia, you had a communist regime established, and Georgia has seized this opportunity in 1917 to declare independence. So Georgia was actually an independent republic for 4 years, from 1917 to 1921, and very advanced one for its time. We had universal ballot, including ballot for women, and really the constitution, which was rather modern by the standards of its day. And at that time, Georgians again started very active diplomacy, sending emissaries to Europe, trying to build bridges with Europe, and there was a modest success. I mean, as you know, this region is very wealthy in resources, not Georgia, but our neighboring countries certainly have lots of resources that were interesting for Europe at the time. But eventually, even though there were some discussions, Georgia was sort of dismissed as too far away country and too unimportant for Europe to pay any attention to what was really happening there. That's a quotation from the discussions at the British Foreign Office at the time regarding the involvement of Europe in the region. So that was followed with 70 years of communist regime, and I want to say that our attempt to integrate Georgia into the European space has, of course, acquired a new momentum when we regained independence in 1991. What is interesting is that, in the last 20 years of our history of Georgia's independence, we have been through ups and downs, in domestic politics as well as in terms of the security situation. We are, let's say, in a troubled region of the world. But there has never been any serious discussion in the Georgian intellectual or political discourse about the European vocation of Georgia, about the European future of Georgia. It is taken for granted that we belong in Europe. There is no line of thought that challenges that idea that the future of Georgia is within Europe. And I would say that that our modern reality and our future was defined by the late Prime Minister of Georgia, Zurab Zhvania, who, when we became part of Council of Europe, declared, "I'm Georgian and therefore I'm a European." And I think that's very much a motto that under which we are building our country and where we see our future. So in the time when you probably hear lots of questions about the future of Europe and why Europe is important, Georgians remain very enthusiastic Europeans. And I think that what I see is very often that people who go to Georgia, they clearly see that, yes, this country is a European country. Because again, the culture is a very important part of diplomacy, and if you actually go and visit and you see our architectural monuments, if you learn about our history, you understand that Georgia, of course, yes, is an ancient maybe one of the oldest European countries, and its rightful place is in Europe. I was pleased that it was recognized by this House, where we are now in the resolution that was adopted last month about Georgia, where the Parliament declared that Georgia is a European state, and that in conjunction with the reference to Article 49, of course, for us creates the hope that one day we can hope and aspire for membership in the European Union. Of course, right now, I mean, there are many questions about what kind of future Europe is facing, but that is for us the final goal, and that we believe that's our destiny. I don't want to bore you with the technical details of relationship between Georgia and the European Union, but I think in general you would agree that relationship between European Union and any non-member state is the one that's for me, the way I see it is that there is a big wall which is separating the European Union from non-member states who are aspiring to be part of Europe. And then, step by step, we are demolishing this wall, opening up the borders for trade, for movement, for exchange, and really integrating into this common culture and common space, which is called a European house. I think we have had substantial success in the last several years. In fact, just a few days ago, the Commission has declared that Georgia will start negotiations in January on free trade agreement. This is something which is important for our economy. We have now visa facilitation agreement with Europe. It's much easier for Georgians to travel. It's much easier for the students to travel to Europe. And we hope we can start talks on visa-free movement next year. We are negotiating the association agreement, which is the highest level of political, political framework of cooperation which the EU can offer to the non-candidate member states, non-candidate third countries. And I think that this is all very positive and very important, and it paves the way for eventually, when there is a political momentum, to discuss the question of further integration. Because clearly Europe is in a very difficult place right now. The last enlargement has created a fatigue of enlargement. The current economic situation, I think, makes it very difficult to talk about further enlargement. And meanwhile, I think we are taking very pragmatic view of our relationship with the EU. We believe that Europe is our future, and before Europe is ready to consider membership of additional countries beyond, let's say, Balkan countries, we will be integrating our economic and political system as closely as we can with the European Union. I think it's also important to note that there is a substantial change from where Europe was in relation to our region from 5 years ago to where we are now. Because many of you might know, or you might not know, that of course after 2008 war between Georgia and Russia, Europe is now one of the major security providers in the region. So the EU monitoring mission, which is deployed in Georgia, and it was deployed as part of the ceasefire agreement following the war, today is the major security guarantee deployed on the ground. It is unfortunate that it happened after the war, because I arrived in Brussels in 2005, end of 2005. And actually, I have spent maybe 3 years between 2005 and the war of 2008 lobbying for such mission, because we were aware of the threats, and we were very much asking for security guarantees deployed on the ground that could be provided only by the European Union, because the Russians were blocking any other international mission, be that OSCE or other organizations where they have, of course, a say. But unfortunately, the European Union at that time felt that either the situation was not as grave as we were trying to explain, or that it was beyond their capacity at that point to address it. And then, of course, we were hit with the crisis. I think that the war between Russia and Georgia has demonstrated to Europe that actually this region is part of European region, and Europe cannot afford to ignore what's happening there. Eastern Partnership, you know, this is a new framework of cooperation with the 6 countries in the region, and I believe it was to some extent a response to the challenges with the EU saw in the region. And part of the Eastern Partnership platform, I mean, substantial part is also about cultural relationships between the EU and Georgia. There is a platform which is dedicated to this, and we very much are encouraging to our, you know, our own, let's say, players to use this framework to promote more the image of Georgia as the European country in Europe, and to use the Eastern Partnership also for cultural diplomacy, if you wish. But of course, also I want to focus maybe a little bit on the challenges, because the you know, Europe is the what is the idea of Europe? Europe is the place which provides the possibility of living together in our diversity together, and, you know, building the society together. And I think we are facing many challenges, not only in the countries which are, let's say, new members or which are aspirant countries, but also within Europe, because the current economic crisis has created many challenges for that idea of diversity and living at peace with each other. In that sense, for us, you know, but I'm sure it's temporary, and I'm sure that what we see a bit emergence of the xenophobic, you know, tendencies and really let's say very negative attitude towards immigrants and etc. I'm sure this is a temporary development which will be addressed and which will go away. But for us, the idea of Europe is also very important, because Georgia is a very diverse country. It's a small country, but we have several ethnic minorities. And traditionally, Georgia has been very much also about creating the space where everybody could live together peacefully. If you go to Tbilisi, I think it's a quite unique place, in a sense that in the main old part of neighborhood of Tbilisi, you have the mosque, Georgian Christian church, Armenian Christian church, and the synagogue right next to each other. And this is very much the idea with which we have lived. Tbilisi was always a very cosmopolitan city, where the many different ethnic groups lived together. And Georgia has always been extremely country of tolerance, country where you could live together and meanwhile maintain your differences. Unfortunately, as we see also in Europe now, economic circumstances, various historical circumstances put strain on this kind of relationships. And this is what happened in the 90s, of course, with the collapse of the USSR, the strong relationships that we have enjoyed with other ethnic minorities living in our region, and surge of nationalism also in Georgia at the time has unfortunately created the roots of the problems that we have to face today. But for us, the solution to this is a European solution. So what we are trying to do vis-a-vis two occupied territories in our country is try to explain to them that their future is much more secure as part of democratic European Georgia than unofficially part of the larger Russian Federation, because you understand that while these two territories, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, were declared as independent states by the Russian Federation, even the Russians themselves don't believe in their independence, because a very good example of that was the last round of negotiations when we negotiated World Trade Organization accession of Russia, and the question concerned movement of goods between Russia and Georgian border in the occupied territories. We are pleased that we have reached the agreement with the Russians on this question, but the truth is that the Russians have negotiated with the Georgian government on this question, and the Abkhaz and the so-called Abkhaz and South Ossetian governments were not even mentioned by the Russians themselves in this context. So and then recently there were elections of the de facto government in South Ossetia, where the results of the elections were thrown out by the court because the candidates supported by Moscow didn't win in these elections, and now they are basically trying to organize new elections that will make sure that the candidate that Moscow prefers will be elected. So what I'm saying is that these territories are, of course, not even nominally independent. They have no future as they are now, and very much what we're trying to promote is to explain to them that we can find solution for their future as part of democratic and European country of Georgia. Europe is playing part in this. We are working quite closely with the EU on the policy which is called engagement without recognition, which basically is very much centered on building people-to-people contacts with the citizens living in occupied territories. And I'm sure that step by step we will be successful in resolving these situations. Though clearly this will take time, and we don't think that it's possible within short time framework. So I think that more or less this is, sort of outline of Georgia and the EU today. Again, we hope that within next 2 years Georgia will have association agreement and free trade agreement with the EU. We hope to have at least to be at the final stages of visa-free movement. We will continue working very closely in the framework of the Eastern Partnership. But clearly I have to also mention that in order for this project to be successful, for the Eastern Partnership to be successful, we also do need more resources. And of course that's something which is a challenge in the current economic situation. We have to be realistic that any policy framework which is not backed up by the resources does not have too many chances to succeed. But meanwhile, Georgia is developing also its economy. We have 5% growth this year, which is a very good result given the common circumstances. And I think we are creating really a new model of development in the region. As you might know, Georgia is the country which is repeatedly praised for its success of fighting against corruption, something which is really remarkable in the region. And in many fields we have, I believe, created extremely impressive story of what the change can bring to the society if you have right orientation. And for us, that's let's say benchmarks where we want to go are very much defined by our vision of our future in Europe. I don't want to talk too long because I prefer to answer questions, so I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eric Monograph. I am an American living in Prague, and I wanted to know, from your experience, is it easier to work with the United States or the European Union? And could you speak about the difference in closeness between the relationship between Georgia and the EU and Georgia and the United States? Thank you.
For some countries, knocking on Europe's door is like knocking on heaven's door. And while meantime, Europe had such a lot of problems like the Eurozone and etc. I would like to know how can cultural diplomacy assist or manage the small countries and their culture in this whole cultural evolution and infrastructure and in this competition with cultural imperialism? Thank you.
This is Itibar from Afghanistan. as you mentioned, a few challenges which the Georgians have with the European Union. One of them was the negative attitude of the European Union with the Georgian immigrants. What kind of negative attitude you are doing with the Georgian immigrants, and what do you think, what are the reasons behind this negative attitude which they are doing with the Georgian immigrants? Thank you.
You mentioned that Georgia has been praised by its fight against corruption, and I would like to, if you could please tell us some examples on how Georgia is coping and doing something.
Well, first of all, the US versus EU. Well, the US is a federal country, but it's one country. The European Union is 27 countries. So I think that the difference in dealing with the United States and dealing with the European Union is very much, it was summed up by Kissinger, who said, give me the number that I can call in in Europe in order to get an answer. And I think that there was an attempt by this, Lisbon Treaty and the last changes to address this question. But clearly, we see that on foreign policy, the European Union is still very much, let's say, the entity consisting of 27 member states, each one with their own national interests, and if I allow myself to make an observation, I think we are now in a historical moment in Europe, because what I think everybody is seeing is that you cannot stay where we are right now. Either we are either the Europe has to move to greater level of integration, or it has to face that the crisis will probably deepen and get worse. So maybe we will see changes which will be really historical in the coming months. But for the moment, I would say foreign policy making process in Europe is still quite, let's say, a national priority, even though on the major strategic issues, I mean, clearly, you have Brussels taking lead, but in close consultations with the capitals. So I think that in that sense, dealing with the European Union is more complicated by the nature of the organization. And the US, I think it's just easier, even if in Washington you have clearly many different players. There is certain, maybe, given the economic situation in Washington, in the US, maybe also you have the process where foreign policy issues are not what are motivating the voters, let's say, the most, and therefore you can see maybe reflection of that in certain aspects of policy making. But clearly Washington is let's say, easier mechanism to move. However, I would say that of course Georgia is a strategic partner of the United States. For us, this relationship is important. As you know, Georgia is a biggest per capita contributor to the mission in Afghanistan outside of NATO member countries. And we have a strategic charter with the United States. Substantial part of the Georgian current elite, including myself, was educated in the United States. And sometimes I have to admit to you that some friends or colleagues in Europe accuse us of having, let's say, more pro-American vision than pro-European. But I find that criticism always unfounded, and they often bring, as an example, the question of education. Why were so many of you educated in the United States? Well, the answer is very simple, and I think you understand this very well. As you know, education is expensive, especially if you come from the countries like former Soviet Union, whether in the US or Europe, it's expensive. In the 90s, there were extensive scholarship projects for the former Soviet countries that funded education in the United States. And as I told one former EU commissioner who attacked me viciously on this point, I told him there were no scholarships to study in Europe. And this is why there are maybe more Georgians educated in the US than in Europe. I mean, it's changing. Now you have more and more people also studying in Europe. But this is why cultural diplomacy is important, So if you invest, you build up the resources. And And that's changing. Now there are, I would say, as many Georgian students studying in Europe, and that's something which is very important. So Georgia believes that, you know, the US is our strategic partner, but European Union is where our future is. So, you know, it's I think, to sum up where we stand. On the cultural diplomacy, help small countries, I think, I mean, it goes to the question of the immigration. I didn't say that there is a particular backlash against immigrants from Georgia. That's not what I meant. What I meant that in general, you see more and more rhetoric in Europe coming from extreme right parties and, you know, others who are trying to portray immigration as a problem, which of course we all know is not an issue, because immigration is also an extremely powerful resource, especially at the time when the population in Europe is not growing at a rate that is desirable, and or I mean that is sustainable in terms of the social system and economic system. But cultural diplomacy in that sense, I think, is important, because what I have discovered very often is that even within the European Union, sometimes people from one country know very little about people from another country, especially from new member states. So sometimes I'm teasing, you know, my Italian friends or my Spanish friends, asking them to name at least one Czech writer, or you know, and I mean it's very much, I think, part of the, in general, it's a problem not only for people who are outside of the EU, but even for member states. But clearly for countries like Georgia, you know, who were not on the map of the world for a long while, you know, we have to do more effort in order to explain who we are in Europe. And I think it's important to negate the perceptions, or, you know, maybe negative perceptions about those countries. On corruption question, I think this is really something which is quite remarkable, because basically what was happening in Georgia, you know that in 2003 we had the Rose Revolution, which changed the government, and you know, this is when I joined the government. Also, I worked in democracy building field, and you know, I mean, I lived abroad before that. So what happened was that in 2003, new government came into power and discovered that, well, not discovered, we all knew that because we lived in this society, that we live in a society where it is criminal bosses who take decisions, you know, on questions concerning people's lives. So I will tell you an anecdote, which is, I think, the best way to deal with this question. My father's car was stolen in pre-revolutionary Georgia, and he had a classmate who was a chief of police, and he called him and asked for his help to find the car. And the chief of police, who was his friend, told him that he should talk to such and such criminal authority, because police went to criminals to solve the problems. And in order to find your stolen car, police would put you in touch with the criminal authority. This was what was happening before 2003. So when revolution happened, basically first thing that they did was the government fired all the policemen. It's a very radical measure, because imagine firing several thousand people in one day and recruiting police force from zero. But there was really no other way to do it. So imagine the police, for example, which had zero confidence in 2003, today enjoys over 90% confidence of the population, and is perceived as the most trusted institution in the country after Orthodox Church. Georgians are very religious, and church enjoys great authority. So this is a very radical change. And also, we have started really implementing very radical measures with respect to corruption from the day one after the revolution. For example, several of my colleagues in the parliament, when I was a member of parliament, were arrested during first 6 months of their mandate on corruption charges. This was all extremely radical because the problem in Georgia was that not that corruption was a sort of isolated problem, but corruption was really a way of living. That's how we lived. You could not get into the university unless you were willing to pay bribes. and depending on which department you wanted to go to, the bribe was different. So, and that's one other field where there has been substantial, radical changes. Basically, we abolished completely the entrance system to the universities, exam system that we used to have, and introduced completely different automated system, that's run basically by the computers, and there is simply no way to corrupt. And good anecdote of this, how this has changed everything, is that I have a summer house in Georgia, and the local villagers are my neighbors, and their daughter, who could never dream of entering the law department of Tbilisi University, because this cost quite a lot in terms of bribes before revolution. She was on top 10 students who entered the law department, on her own. And she couldn't even dream about that. So it's radical change. I'm not saying that everything is solved, that all problems are solved, but today polling shows that that majority, over 90% of Georgians, tell you that they don't interact with they don't encounter corruption in their daily lives. And this is the country where 8 years ago, honestly, I couldn't receive a certificate that I needed, without paying a bribe. And I think that's something which is very important. The administration, the system of justice has been reformed in a way that we have now this extremely modern system of issuing documents, and basically all the interaction that citizen has with the state is happening in a very efficient and very sort of transparent and very clear way. And I have to tell you, and I'll end on this because this is, of course, very fascinating topic that I can talk a lot about, that even in Russia, people are looking at the model of the police reform in Georgia, because basically in the former Soviet space, people cannot believe that you can reform the police form as we did within really few years' time. So I think this is not only an administrative change or a political change. This is cultural revolution in a sense, and this will make sure that the future generation of citizens of the Georgians are different, because a citizen who grows up in the country where his rights are violated by police, where he knows that he can bribe his way through the police, the citizen who from childhood learns that he cannot go to the university of his choice unless he is willing to pay a bribe, that citizen will not grow up, cannot grow up a citizen of modern free state. And therefore this cultural revolution is extremely important, and it will make sure that the future generations of the Georgians are all thinking in a completely different and liberated way, because I think right now you still have substantial differences between people who have experienced outside world and people who have been spent all their lives in the closed Soviet and post-Soviet system. And we're making sure we're investing into our future, because that's the only future, that's the only way to secure the future of our country.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you all to please join me in expressing our gratitude for Her Excellency Ambassador Salome Samadashvili. Thank you.